The Haunted Librarium, an Irish Incantations short story, written by authors Trisha Tilde and T.N. Teague. Chapter 1. Victoria gently pushed open the heavy library door, and Simon dashed through the gap with enthusiasm. His jet-black tail swished from side to side as his long legs propelled him forward. He was a large cat, his coat sleek and of a deep, glossy black color. As he ran forward, Simon's claws clattered on the tiled entryway, echoing in the large building. "Right!" Victoria said firmly, coming up to him before she knelt down and ran her hand over the thick fur of his back. "We'll only be here for a few minutes, so no running off too far, okay?" Simon rolled his eyes while making an exaggerated groan. He had grown used to her fussing over him. It was a part of their daily routine ever since they moved away from the United States. Even though he grumbled under his breath, deep down he knew that her constant scolding was her human way of showing him love. Simon had always felt like the odd one out in his old coven. The witch's familiars didn't seem to like him as much as they did the others, and their humans weren't too fond of Victoria either. Before coming to Ireland, Simon was there for Victoria through thick and thin. He had been her best friend. Now, however, Victoria and Simon now had their own friends, Siobhan and Chiara for Victoria, and Nutmeg and Onyx for Simon. Simon scanned the building, trying to appear casual as he searched for his animal buddies. He heard a muffled panting coming from beneath the stairs at the back of the library. He broke into a smile and sprinted towards it. Sure enough, there was one of his furry friends huddled at the bottom of the stairs. Nutmeg, Siobhan's terrier familiar, was staring intently at the top of the stairs that led to the second floor of the library. His neck was straining against his collar, and he was growling softly. The hound's sandy-colored ears, perched forward like two tiny satellites, were listening intently for whatever had sparked his interest. Simon looked up, trying to see what his friend was so focused on, but nothing stood out as unusual. There wasn't anyone visible or anything else out of place. The only thing that stirred was an occasional spark from the low-hanging chandeliers that shone against the wood floor. "What are we looking at?" Simon asked. Nutmeg barked urgently, and Simon felt a thrill of alarm. Something happened. Simon waited for Nutmeg to explain, but when the dog didn't say anything, he rolled his eyes. "Are you going to tell me what's wrong?" "I heard something," replied Nutmeg before returning his gaze back up the stairs. Well, that explained absolutely nothing, Simon thought. Simon's eyes slowly scanned the ancient library, taking in the colorful light of the stained glass windows, the never-ending shelves of time-worn books, and the low voices from where Victoria and her friends sat in plush armchairs by the entrance. He furrowed his brow and he let out a labored sigh, turning to Nutmeg with an air of long-suffering patience. "This is a library," Simon said slowly, clarifying just in case Nutmeg had forgotten where his human worked. "There's all sorts of random sounds in such a big public building." Nutmeg's ears twitched in frustration. "I heard a loud bang from upstairs and Siobhan had left, so I went to take a look," he said in a flat voice. His gaze never shifted from the stairs as he spoke, as if he was expecting something to suddenly appear there. "What did you find?" Simon prodded. Sometimes conversations with Nutmeg were like pulling teeth. "Nothing," the dog snapped back gruffly. "No humans, no animals, and nothing out of place." "So you've just been sitting at the bottom of the stairs and staring ever since?" Nutmeg let out an exasperated sigh and gave a weary nod. Wow, Simon thought. Some animals had way too much time on their hands. Though not every familiar could have a human as exciting as Simon's. Traveling the world, solving murders, and escaping from villains was all in a day's work for Simon's human Victoria. "Well, I wish you luck," Simon said as he backed away, his tail held confidently in the air like a flag. He wound his way between the bookcases, stopping here and there to rub his back along the corner of one before continuing. His whiskers twitched with curiosity as he inhaled the distinct scent of paper, glue, dust, and mildew from all the old books and furniture that filled the library. For him, this place was not only full of knowledge, but also of all the smells of the people who had been here in the past. At the back of the library, in a corner filled with shadows, a single ray of light sneaked its way through a dusty window. The highest shelves had items so ancient and forgotten that they no longer held any real value. That's where Simon found Onyx, on top of a pile of old newspapers, his nose tucked under his back leg. As soon as Simon came closer, the rat stirred and turned his head toward him as if he could sense his presence despite the thick carpeting muffling the cat's footsteps. "Your brother is weird," Simon told him. Simon knew that if Onyx was human, he would have shrugged his shoulders. Instead, the rat simply twitched the whiskers on his nose before laying his head down again. Simon gave up. If everyone was going to be boring, maybe it'd be better to take a nap. He knew that Victoria had said earlier that they were only going to be in the library for a little while, but he knew that was a lie. He had heard this conversation countless times before. Her assurances that they wouldn't stay long, and then her inevitable detour to the library stacks. She would scan the shelves until something caught her eye, and then she'd be off, grabbing a few volumes before heading off to chat with her friends about all the gossip of the village. Tentatively, Simon approached Onyx and took a whiff of his head before settling down next to the rat. He curled up in a little ball, about to drift off into a slumber when all of a sudden an overwhelming boom filled the room. Simon shot up in fear as he watched the bookcase several feet away crash onto the ground, causing the walls to tremble and debris to scatter in all directions. Chapter 2. The air filled with a loud and jarring cacophony as Nutmeg's high-pitched barking could be heard over the low whimpering of Onyx. The three witches who ran towards where Simon was now standing over the quivering form of Onyx added to the noise, their voices raised in alarm and anger. As they approached, he saw their hair whipping around them like snakes in a frenzy. Victoria was at the head of the pack, careening past a bookshelf before she managed to stabilize herself. "Simon!" she called out urgently, her voice full of worry and fear for what she might find. As she came closer, he could see the veins bulging on her neck and the sweat glistening on her forehead from her exertion. He tried to calm himself down, but it was hard with all the commotion happening around him. Kiara dashed past Victoria, calling Onyx's name. Nutmeg's sharp barks bounced off the walls as he and Siobhan raced behind her toward Simon and Onyx. Simon hopped off from where he was standing over Onyx, and Kiara went over to scoop the rat into her arms, carefully examining him before determining that he was unscathed. With a sigh of relief, she planted a small kiss on the top of his head. Victoria rushed to Simon's side, her eyes wide and frantic. With trembling hands, she ran them over him, as if trying to memorize the shape of him. She moved him gently, feeling for any bruises or wounds that would indicate he'd been hurt when the bookcase fell. Simon gave her closest arm a reassuring lick. "Oh, gods," she breathed out. "Are you okay?" Simon nuzzled into her hand. "I'm fine. Just shaken." Victoria smiled and brushed away the tears that had started to spill down her cheeks. "But not stirred?" she asked with a weak smile, referencing Simon's favorite movie series. "What happened?" Siobhan shouted as she came closer, Nutmeg on her heels. She stood in stunned silence, surveying the disaster that had befallen her library. All of those books and manuscripts, the precious only copies of ancient texts now destroyed. The bookshelf that never quite matched the others now lay on its side. Large splinters jutted out from every board and plank, like broken bones. They crunched under her feet when she walked over them to see what damage had been done. Books were strewn all around her, some spines broken and their leather covers split open. Others had been flung into corners or crushed by other books. Some of them were split apart entirely into individual pages, while others lay open to reveal their insides. Nutmeg perked up his ears and began sniffing the air, trying to take in as much information as he could. Victoria completed her inspection of Simon and let him go. "What happened?" she questioned Simon. "I don't know," he replied. "I had just laid down and shut my eyes when suddenly there was a loud bang and the bookcase fell over." Simon spoke, knowing only Victoria could understand him. He noticed Onyx and Nutmeg repeating his words to their own humans, as all familiars can only communicate with their respective witches. The witches moved closer to the broken bookcase, kicking up a cloud of dust as they began feverishly sifting through the rubble. "What could have caused this?" Siobhan nearly wept. "These shelves were hundreds of years old and incredibly sturdy. I've never even heard of one collapsing. Plus, the enchantments that hover over this entire building should have prevented it." Simon approached Onyx and gave him a quick snuffle to be sure he was okay. As Simon was feeling physically well himself, he assumed Onyx was too, yet the rat was still giving tiny trembles every couple of seconds. The effect of coffee's caffeine paled in comparison to the rush of being startled awake by something several hundreds of times taller than you, nearly tumbling straight onto your skull. No wonder the small creature was still so jumpy. Simon gave the rat a couple licks along its head, trying to calm the rat down. With a deep sigh, Onyx seemed to release all his tension at once, finally losing the stiff way he was holding himself. "Thanks," Onyx whispered. Simon nodded and gave one last lick before shifting his attention to Nutmeg, who had his muzzle buried deep in a pile of papers. The deep breaths the dog was taking was probably audible to even the humans, Simon thought. Nutmeg suddenly lifted his head, causing a flurry of documents to fall to the side, before he darted off and ran away. "What in the world?" Simon muttered under his breath as he watched Nutmeg bolt for the stairs. He followed, pushing off from the floor with each step and clearing any objects that stood in their way. They sprinted up to the second level of the library. The light from the chandelier bounced off the polished wooden flooring, producing a rhythmic sound of clicking claws as they hastened ahead. Nutmeg halted at one of the bookshelves in the middle of the room and bent down to sniff at the novels at its base, his ears twitching with curiosity. "What's wrong?" Simon asked, stepping forward to join the dog. Nutmeg lifted his snout and took a deep inhale before responding. "It's that same smell." Simon leaned over and took a whiff of what had been drawing Nutmeg's attention. He could smell the books, the dust, and the ever-present musty air that hung around in most of the buildings in the village that had been built before electricity was invented. But there was a faint smell underneath it. The odor of old wooden shelves, the crinkle of browned pages, and dusty hardcovers gave way to something warm. Perhaps a cigarette. It wasn't entirely unpleasant, though. Rather like a good pipe tobacco. Then an undertone of something peppery, and he sneezed as it tickled his nose. Simon stepped away as he pondered what else Nutmeg's incredible nose had picked up. "You sniffed this out down there?" Simon questioned. "It was underneath the papers next to the bookshelf," Nutmeg replied. "When I came up here earlier, I noticed a different smell, but I didn't think much of it." "Do you think the strange noise you heard up here might be related to the bookcase downstairs shattering into a million pieces?" Nutmeg's gaze roved over the structure. "Except for the odd scent, nothing seemed out of place when I was here before, and we still have no idea as to what triggered the incident down there." "Right," Simon said. "And I definitely would have noticed someone near enough to me to topple a large wooden bookcase." A light pitter-pattering of footsteps sounded out, and Simon turned to see Onyx coming around the corner. "The humans are leaving," Onyx said as he came closer. "They're really just going to leave the mess behind?" Nutmeg asked, disappointed. Onyx shook his head. "Siobhan and Kiara have gone off to find Evie, to report what happened and see if she knows what could have caused all this," he said. "What about Victoria?" Simon asked. "She's gone to find Colin," Onyx replied. "We need a professional repairman if we're going to get this place back in order." Simon shook his head in amusement. As usual, Victoria's first thought was of that man, Colin. Simon hadn't had a chance to get a good look at him yet, or to put the fear of God in him, and make sure he wasn't taking advantage of their mutual friend. Unfortunately, there was no way for Simon to just come right out and ask Colin what his true intentions were. He'd have to find another way to vet the guy. But that was a thought for another time. "Did they just leave us all here?" Simon asked Onyx. "I told them we were okay." Onyx said, "Someone needs to watch over the library while they're gone anyway, if only to make sure that it's not completely destroyed." Simon nodded. "We'll just have to solve the problem of what is causing all this before they come back." Chapter 3. The familiars eagerly scurried around the library, each one taking a different path in their search. Onyx clambered up the stairs to check the nooks and crannies that Nutmeg couldn't reach. With his nose quivering, he sniffed at each book and bookend, nibbling at little bits of cover from the volumes he had no intention of actually reading. Nutmeg started with the bottom shelves near the front door of the library, while Simon hopped up from one shelf to another. His curious eyes quickly scanned across each text underlined or marked on with post-it notes as he jumped from step to step. He came across several main sections that were especially well read, like languages, biology, and alchemy. He pondered if this smell could be hiding in one of these areas, but couldn't find any trace of the sweet cigarettes of the peppery odor. Simon's nose began to tingle as he inhaled the dust that filled the air, and he made a mental note to recommend someone comes to clean up here shortly. On one of the bookcases on the highest shelves sat an old bird nest veiled in spider webs. As Simon climbed higher towards the ceiling, the amount of cobwebs increased significantly, along with the number of spiders scurrying back and forth across the sticky threads. Simon stopped in his tracks as he saw the largest spider web he had ever seen, extending from one end of the bookcase to another. Simon gazed in awe at the intricate masterpiece of spider silk. The web was spread between two bookcases, stretching up and across to form a perfect geometrical shape. Sunlight streamed through the stained glass window, turning the glistening silk strands a deep blood-red color. A big fly, fluttering desperately against its fate, was caught in the center of the sticky webbing. Each time it attempted to break free, more threads bound it tightly to the woodwork until it had no hope of escape. Simon watched as the large spider slowly crept down its web with 8 beady eyes gleaming hungrily at its prey. At home, Whenever Simon found a spider in the spaces Victoria frequented, it was his job to catch and remove it. She disliked all bugs, apart from bees, despite her work tending plants in a greenhouse. Maybe when he had more free time, he could return and help Siobhan out here in the library. Simon found himself perched atop the bookshelves on the upper floor of the library. The smells were a bit more stifling up here due to its further distance from the open windows and entry doors, but he didn't mind. He trekked along the walls, pausing every now and then to take a whiff up at the ceiling. When he had almost made it to the back wall of the second floor of the library and was tall enough to give the ceiling a good sniff, a familiar peppery scent filled his nostrils. Sweet tobacco after notes followed shortly after, and Simon knew he had found what he was searching for. Simon leapt off the bookcase shelf onto the next, his feet agilely finding their target. He couldn't contain his excitement as he shouted, "Found it!" and sped towards the stairs. Onyx had already joined his brother below, and Simon watched from above as they both paced around the walls, their noses skimming the floorboards for any sign of a scent. "Guys, get up here!" Simon yelled at the top of his lungs to alert the other two. Nutmeg's ears perked up as he heard Simon's call, and both Onyx and Nutmeg lifted their heads in the direction of Simon's voice at the foot of the stairs. "Hey! Upstairs!" Simon shouted again, this time getting a more enthusiastic response from the pair as they darted over to join him. They raced up the rest of the stairs and onto the second floor of the library. Simon guided the others to the bookcase in the rear of the room. "It's near the ceiling," he said. Onyx examined the dusty shelves, his eyes traveling from top to bottom until finally returning to Simon with an arched eyebrow. "I suppose we'll just have to take your word for it," he said. Simon gave a full body shake, offended. "I can't take you up there," he said, "but I'm telling the truth about the smell coming from that direction." Nutmeg nodded slowly. "That's where the attic is," he murmured to himself. "Wait, there's an attic too?" Simon was curious as to what lay hidden in the highest corner of the library. The building already occupied a large portion of the main street and was already bursting at the seams with books. Could it be that there were even more volumes tucked away in this secret area? Nutmeg nodded. "Siobhan hosts a monthly show for the wee babbies in the village. The attic is where she stores all her costumes and other items like stuffed animals and props," he said. Simon swore an oath to the gods that if she had a clown costume up there, he would never speak another word to that witch. He'd give her a wide berth every time he encountered her in the village. "We're going to have to go up there to check it out, aren't we?" Onyx asked in a quiet voice. "Oh, come on, I'm sure it'll be fun." Simon lied. Chapter 4. Simon was overjoyed to find out that the secret passage to the attic was the bookcase in front of him. Nutmeg gave him instructions on how to open it. Simon looked around and noticed a book in the middle shelf had a hidden button beneath it. He pushed the button with a soft click, then heard a low hum as the bookcase ever so gradually opened up, revealing a flight of winding steps leading to the attic entrance. Simon looked up and caught sight of the dusty winding staircase tucked away behind some old library shelves. He grinned to himself. He knew Victoria would appreciate this discovery just as much as he did. He tried to recall if Siobhan had ever mentioned secret library doors before, but with all the drama lately, chasing down clues to solve a murder, Siobhan's ex-boyfriend suddenly resurfacing, it was no wonder she hadn't remembered. He made a mental note to bring Victoria up here later. He wondered if there were any secret passages at the bed and breakfast that he and Victoria were staying at. The rooms there had been decorated with a mix of rustic antiques and framed paintings that were perhaps hundreds of years old, pieces from another time that carried an air of mystery about them. There were all sorts of suspicious-looking picture frames on the walls that could be hiding anything behind them. He'd have to go exploring later. Nutmeg took the lead, his eyes glowing in the darkness of the stairwell as he warily placed one paw after another on each step. Simon and Onyx followed closely behind, their ears twitching with anticipation. The ancient wood creaked beneath their paws, setting off Simon's racing heart as they approached the tiny doorway at the top. Nutmeg pushed it open with his snout, and Simon tensed up, ready to react should anything appear. Nutmeg slowly inched his way towards the entrance of the attic, carefully avoiding creaking floorboards. Onyx was still standing at the threshold, staring intently ahead. Simon stepped over him and peered into the room, allowing himself to relax slightly when he saw that no clown costumes or creepy dolls were waiting for them as he expected. With a bit more confidence than he entered with, Simon made his way to the center of the attic. A big box in the corner was filled to the brim with handcrafted felt puppets, each one carefully sewn and adorned with bright beads for eyes. A second box contained a hodgepodge of stuffed animals, tigers, bears, ducks, pandas, and even an octopus. Now, at the far end of the room were a few carpets rolled into cylinders, featuring vibrant cartoon characters with exaggerated expressions. But what really pulled Simon's attention was the large clothing rack next to the lone round window. There was everything from a chef's costume to a princess dress, and even a set of cheap fairy wings hanging from a clothes hanger. "What did you say Siobhan uses these for again?" Simon asked. Nutmeg stopped his search along the edge of the room and answered, "Monthly story time. Each month she dresses up and reads a children's book, and families come and drop off their kids for an hour or two. Chiara brings biscuits to story time sometimes," Onyx stated. This piqued Simon's interest, and he thought that if there were baked treats, he might just come for the next session. He would even let some of the children stroke his head if the gesture was done gently. "Do you smell anything?" Onyx asked. "Oh yes, right," Simon remembered. "They were here for a purpose." "The smell is faint," Nutmeg said, snuffling along the floor and stirring up some dirt in the process. Simon decided to bury his head in the box of puppets and take a deep breath. He immediately regretted it as a syrupy sweet scent filled his nostrils. He guessed it was from all of the children that had played with these toys over time, each of their sticky hands smearing the fabric with their candy leftovers. Nutmeg's lips curled back, baring his sharp fangs as he growled at the rack of clothing. His entire body was tense, and he didn't move a muscle when Simon crept up from behind, careful to place each paw step with precision. The familiar pungent smell grew stronger with each step Simon took, and as he reached the edge of the clothing rack, they moved closer, forming a triangle around it. "If a clown jumps out," Simon muttered quietly, "you two are on your own." Onyx shushed him, but Simon figured they were in agreement. Nutmeg settled back on his haunches, preparing to pounce. However, before he had the chance to launch himself forward, a white circle of light spread around him. It grew larger until it completely surrounded him in a glowing sphere, obscuring his features until he was almost transparent. It appeared as though a ghostly presence had stepped through the solid walls and materialized in the attic beside them. "Ghost!" Onyx yelped, scrambling back towards the door with Simon chasing after him. Chapter 5. The next thing Simon knew, he was tumbling down the stairs and emerging from the library onto the bright street outside. He could feel his eyes squinting against the blinding light of day. "Oh my gods," he exclaimed to no one in particular. "What was that?" Onyx scrambled up to Simon, his breath coming in heavy, shallow bursts. His fur was matted with sweat, and his sides heaved with the effort of running. The moment he stopped beside him, panting and shaking, Simon's expression changed as understanding dawned on him. His eyes widened with fear, and he gasped, "Nutmeg is still up there with a ghost?" Onyx glanced back at the library in dread, only to find that the dog had escaped out of its doors just in time. "Appreciate you giving me a hand back there," Nutmeg declared, breathing heavily as he came to a stop close to Onyx. "My bad," Simon replied apologetically. "Are you all right?" Onyx asked, running his eyes over Nutmeg for any sign of injury. The dog answered with a nod and replied, "It didn't hurt when I was trapped in the light. The most overwhelming sensation was the smell," he said, coughing slightly. "The tobacco was so strong I tried not to breathe in too deeply." "Well, this has been fun," Simon started as he gave a full body shake. "But there's a bed calling my name, and I haven't had my midday nap yet, so I'm just going to go." "Don't be thick," Onyx said. "You can't leave now. We have to get rid of that ghost." "Or," Simon countered, "we stick a condemned sign on the front of the building and we all go about our days." "I stay in the library with Siobhan for most of the day," Nutmeg replied to Simon's response. Simon chose not to say that Siobhan should probably consider a different career. He knew it wouldn't help matters. "Very well, then," Simon sighed. "But since none of us are ghost hunters, let's locate our humans and get them involved." Nutmeg nodded in agreement. The three familiars then began their journey towards the bed and breakfast. If their humans were not there, perhaps Abigail could find them for them. As they strolled down the pavement, they were lucky to come across their humans walking together in a pack towards them. Victoria and Colin were leading the party, Victoria giggling at something Colin had said. Siobhan and Chiara followed closely behind them with Evie, the high priestess of the Coven, and her daughter Tara bringing up the rear. The animals ran to their respective humans, with Simon hopping into Victoria's arms at her outstretched hands. They quickly explained the events of the library and described the ghostly figure they had encountered. Simon purred affectionately as Victoria cooed back. Once the witches shared what their familiars had told them, Evie was first to take charge and issue orders. "All right," Evie began. "Victoria, you'll need to head to the greenhouse and pick out some lavender and sage. Xiara, you should go to your craft store for 4 large white candles and 4 bundles of matches. Siobhan, grab a few glass bowls from your mother's kitchen and fill them with salt." As all the others scrambled to do as she asked, Simon found her requests a bit strange, yet he refrained from voicing his opinion. In no time at all, everyone was back in the library with their things and huddling together. "Right," Evie continued. "Victoria, you need to divide the plants into 4 parts and put each portion into a bowl of salt. Next, Kiara should place the candles on top of all this. Subsequently, we need to set the bowls at each corner of the library and light them simultaneously." Simon trudged after Victoria and Colin, their footsteps echoing in the hushed library, making it seem even more quiet than usual. Siobhan and Kiara strode off to the corner opposite them, while Evie and Tara took up vigilant positions at either end of the long room, their faces serious and determined. "On the count of 3!" Evie shouted from the other side of the building. "1!" Evie began, and Simon felt a chill run down his spine as an eerie moan reverberated through the walls. The ground beneath them seemed to come alive, rumbling like thunder beneath their feet. Books flew from shelves with explosive force, crashing against the floorboards with reverberating thuds. 2! Victoria lit the match and held it near the candle that was sat on the ground. Simon hissed as an eerie light emanated from the floor below, gradually intensifying in brightness. Soon the large room was filled with the acrid scent of tobacco, overpowering any hint of lavender that had been lingering in the air before. 3! Evie shouted, and Victoria took a deep breath before touching the lit match to the candle wick. A deafening whistle filled the library as the mysterious figure glowed brighter and brighter until it vanished in an instant. The shaking of the building abruptly stopped, while Simon slumped to the ground in relief. The repulsive stench that had been permeating from the figure was gone. Evie's voice filled the library as she gave a final instruction. "Extinguish your candles, but leave the bowls where they are." Colin briefly licked his fingers before snuffing out the flame with his forefinger and thumb, pulling back quickly with a curse. Humans. Simon thought critically with a shake of his head. Simon left the humans alone to do what they needed to do, and made his way towards his 4-legged friends. As he approached, Onyx's tail wagged once in anticipation, and Nutmeg studied the candle with concentration, as if expecting a spark at any moment. "So what now?" Onyx asked. A wide yawn escaped from Simon as he arched his body in one big stretch. "I think I'm entitled to a nap," he replied. "But what about the mess?" Nutmeg eyed the group of humans now gathered around the scattered pieces of the bookcase, which had started this whole supernatural ordeal. "There's 6 people here," Simon pointed out, "and anyway, we already did our part and put our lives at risk." "He's right," Onyx reasoned with his brother. Nutmeg gave one last decisive nod, and then started walking to the front door of the library. "Where are you going?" Simon called out to his friend. "Let's go home," Nutmeg suggested as he yawned. "I'd prefer to take my nap there." Simon thought that was a great suggestion, and after taking one last look at the humans looking through the mess, he chased after his pals in pursuit of finding an ideal spot with plenty of sunshine for them to snooze in. This short story is a part of the Irish Incantation book universe. To read the other books in the series, click the link below. Thank you.